Well, thanks for joining today. Now, before we get started again, most of this time is going to be for Azra and team to walk us through the current version of the interactive dashboard, and then hopefully we'll have some questions and or requests or some feedback for them that they can use on iterating it, updating it. We expect that, and understand that it's going to take more than today. We'll give you more time than just today to really dive in and give that feedback. Also, we think that this could be a final PMT for Reel 2, and that we've talked about moving away from the PMT mechanism where we need everyone to get together regularly to discuss status updates, when we've moved to having smaller kind of core group meetings with senior representatives from RFS and each of the partners, where we can talk about strategic issues, where we don't need to have everyone set aside time for that. And then in terms of status updates on the work plan or different knowledge management events, we're going to do that through separate mechanisms, both through kind of online version of the work plan that we can all update regularly. And then if we need to have specific calls related to KM or communications events, we'll do that through a KM and comms call. So I think based on earlier conversations with the center, we've agreed we'll probably move away from this PMT format that we've used thus far. Having said that, this is a really great opportunity to share I4DEI's work with this wider group. So thanks for being available today. And we'll touch base on that, on our plans for meetings going forward after I4DEI's presentation. But without further ado, I'll kick it over to you, Azra, and you can start walking us through.
Okay, great. I'm going to just figure out how to share here. So let's see if this is working. Do you see a slide?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to walk you first through a couple of slides just to give you some background to where we are right now and how we got there. So today's presentation is going to have two elements. One is just this sort of background using this PowerPoint, and the second element is going to be us taking you through the actual live version of the current draft of the actual data visualization. So let's get there as soon as we can. So just by way of giving you this background, our task was to develop synthesis of findings from about 30 reports and learning products that we have been given from the work of Reel over the years. And these reports spanned countries and focus, but the idea was to present in a visual form these findings and takeaways in a practical and visually appealing format, communicating these results and takeaways for the different audiences. So initially, our goal was to develop the visualizations that may have been static, in a static form like infographic, and you will see that we've kind of departed from that idea and gone to a more interactive format, which you're going to see in a little bit. But our approach was to go through all of these documents that we have, and about 330 indicators that we found across board between all of these different studies. And we mapped these indicators from these documents in a way to kind of see what are the common indicators that cut across different contexts and different time periods as well, so that we can figure out what is the storyline that we can show in numbers versus also a qualitative story, or basically conclusions or findings that can be told in a different format that is not necessarily numerical in nature. So from this initial set of 30 documents, 330 indicators, we kind of came down to about 169 indicators that were grouped in 10 categories, which is where we basically departed into conducting synthesis from that. And the synthesis then further developed these 4 larger buckets that the story is presented in. One bucket about shocks and stresses, which also has subcategories within it. Then next bucket around coping strategies and indicators that sit within the coping strategies, 4 subcategories there: resilience capacities and food security. And basically, hold on, how do I move this? Oh, there we go. In addition to looking at quantitative data, the numbers in these reports, baseline and endline reports in particular, we also looked at case studies and did a lot of synthesis of the qualitative information. And the key topics for these syntheses included these 3 main topics: the humanitarian assistance and resilience relationships, kind of looking at factors in humanitarian assistance that were essential for setting the stage for effective resilience programming. And then also looking at factors in relationship between humanitarian assistance and resilience development programming as they relate to promoting or impeding community and household resilience. So what is contributing and how, and what can be sort of concluded from that. The second topic was around resilience framework components and interactions. So we were looking at different resilience capacities and how they affected coping, and looking for ways to synthesize some of that, and how do these components interact with each other, and also what distinct types of environmental shocks affect food security and community and household coping mechanisms. So we looked at learnings and promising practices across all 3 of these, and then you will see in a little bit some of the key takeaways from that. And the third component of our synthesis, the focus of our synthesis, was around program policy implications. We were looking at all of these studies in different contexts and trying to piece together a story of what has the most positive impact on household resilience and how, under which circumstances, and what policy and program design recommendations can be identified from those reports and case studies. While we initially focused on policy and program design recommendations, we actually found a lot of learning from these studies that relates to monitoring and evaluation as well. So we've added that as a particular separate category. And then here you can see the actual reports or documents that most informed the visualizations that you're going to see. So, so you can basically see here both qualitative and quantitative indicators and where they come from. And as you can see, the first set of studies that were done by Mercy Corps, those were qualitative in nature. Those are case studies, while the other studies, starting from the Prime Recurrent Monitoring Survey all the way down to Zimbabwe, contained both qualitative and quantitative data. So when we looked at the quantitative data, we basically took all of different numbers behind indicators that we mapped to kind of belong with each other and across time periods, and try to come up with a picture that is consistent and cuts across different contexts, but also provide for a way for each country to sort of be understood in its own right, in its own way. Because we saw, and I know you are all very familiar with this, that, very often these studies, while they use the same framework, in their implementation, there was departure due to one reason or another from that sort of standard methodology. So some indicators weren't collected in both studies, or they weren't collected in different contexts. So we saw quite a lot of challenge there to basically present a picture that cuts across. So that was one of the most difficult things for us to solve in how we presented quantitative data. With the qualitative data, of course, it was much easier because given the topics that I just presented, we already had a frame of reference for how to process and how to basically compare qualitative data across different contexts. So, and really this challenge with how much overlap there is in how indicators were collected across different countries and different time periods led us to actually decide more towards this interactive data presentation, because it really does allow more that flexibility to show data for different contexts. So 1 second here, data for different contexts in a way that is independent of each other, but also sort of tells a coherent story. So, so that's what I have in terms of the slides and just the background to where we are. And I know most of you are just really keen on seeing the actual report. So what is it that we're talking about here? So before I move to present to you the actual online visualization, I'm going to take a quick pause here and just give you a chance to ask questions, because I can't see you or the questions as we proceed. So I'm going to take a pause here for a sec.
I have a quick question. This is Anne Swindale from USAID. You said that you had a universe of 30 reports, and then in this slide 5, it's basically narrowed down to 12. So what happened to the other reports?
The other reports. So when we did this initial mapping, it resulted in this overwhelming Excel document that basically had for columns all of the reports, and then for rows it had indicators, these 330 indicators that I mentioned before. And then as we looked to narrow, we were really looking for which reports tell a similar story, or how much consistency there is between these different reports, and what can we take away from them. So we read all of them, all 30. But in the end, because there was quite a number of discrepancies between how different reports looked at the indicators or the depth through which they looked at them, obviously some were just one-time studies versus baseline endline studies. So as a team together, between our team at I4DI here and Tango and Save the Children and Mercy Corps, we came up with this solution that basically was to focus on these 12, which had most meat, so to speak, about this story, and then also best sort of opportunity to aggregate and show that picture at the aggregate and then at the disaggregate level. So if anybody else from the team wants to add to this, please go ahead.
Only slightly, and that is, as Ezra said, and we started with a universe of what we had produced, right? And going through that publications list, trying to decide with I4DI what was going to be most useful for their purposes. So again, there are, certainly thought pieces on there that both Tango and Mercy Corps have developed. The guidance notes are really rich for capacity strengthening and certainly draw on programming experience, but don't incorporate the kind of concrete data that I4DI needed to work with in this context. So of the 30 deliverables or documents that we might draw from, it was that much smaller sense that they could synthesize either quantitatively or qualitatively with the data collected.
Okay.
Another point that is important to take into account, Anne, is that when we were first starting Rule 1, we had a number of Title II projects that were trying to incorporate resilience into their activities, or at least the measurement of it. And they were going for different streamlined versions of the set of capacities they included. So the indicator sets were not the same as they were for like the prime or the rise or the stuff that we were doing on these big impacted things. And that finally promoted us to put that more comprehensive guidelines together so that people wouldn't just do willy-nilly whatever set of indicators they thought they could include. So, originally Bangladesh and Nepal and Mali and Ethiopia, the Title II projects in Ethiopia, Title II projects in DRC, other places didn't necessarily use the full set of capacities that we were using in these longer impact evaluations. So that's why some of the discrepancies between the reports in terms of the indicators that they were looking at.
Well, I think that's an important point. I just wanted to add on, Tim, is that there are other data sets that have some or most of the indicators that I4DI has looked at. And in some cases, those are beyond that generated by real, right? So if we look at some of the BHA analyses, and we could even follow that trail a little bit further and look now at some of the analysis Impel or other mechanisms that our measuring resilience have. But we really did face a situation where we needed to define very for I4DI what they had to work with. And just so that we're, you know, responsible for the evidence generated under real, we wanted to kind of encapsulate that without extending onto other kind of mechanisms for now.
But, you know, in that thing that you shared with us, Tom, from them, I did notice some of the Impel evaluations were included in that. Amalia, for example, from Zimbabwe, or
Yeah.
so it wasn't, I mean, which is good. I'm glad you included those resilience projects in this, but they weren't necessarily.
The Zimbabwe resilience research, yeah, that you collected as part of that first round of Zimbabwe work, yes, and that was funded under REAL, not under Impel. Impel didn't exist at that time. We're doing follow-on work in Zimbabwe that includes resilience measurement that we have not included.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And you will see, I mean, as we now proceed to the part where I show you the actual visualization, some of those solutions and challenges and solutions that we have included in how we dealt with this. So I'm going to resume my sharing here so that you can actually see the page. I don't know what, do you see the page?
Yes, there's the page.
Okay, great. So, okay, is the recording still on? I mean, I see that it asked me to give permission, so here we go. Actually, we're going to share this link with you. This is not a public, you cannot find this publicly, but if you know the actual link extension, you can go to it. And we're going to share this with you later so that you can play with this on your own time and provide feedback, because what you're seeing here is an initial draft of that visualization, which sits as a page. A web page with basically 3 right now additional tabs where additional information is about the project and about the report, and obviously the main page here, the home page. So the mock-up you've all seen was an earlier version of this as it was basically being designed. But what you see here now is more what we're going to end up with once we have the feedback, obviously, and that feedback is integrated. The page you're seeing is 508 compliant. So it's got accessibility score that does not show any accessibility issues. And the color selection here is resembling color selection that was used by your teams. So that's just in terms of the background. And in terms of the composition of the page contains key sort of sections, and each section has some static information and some interactive information that you can see and interact with these charts to see what they're showing. So here, for example, the first section is focusing on measuring effects and effectiveness of humanitarian assistance, and talks about most common forms of humanitarian assistance by program. And you can see, for example, which of the programs had cash assistance and cash for assets or food aid or and so forth. Or you can also look at it by program itself and then see what the program itself was focused on providing. And then there's a popover if you hover over one of these that basically allows you to see some basic conclusions around these types of humanitarian assistance. So obviously at this point in time, this is still a draft, just much like Tom said. We are at this point looking for feedback. It was a lot of synthesis data that we had to do and to sift through in order to come up with some conclusions, and messaging of these conclusions is important. And of course, it is also possible that we got something wrong and that we need to be steered in terms of how to present that better, to do better justice to the program, and also to the end users and present the data in a more digestible format. The next section here is looking at that humanitarian assistance, and again, factors that are essential for effective resilience-focused programming. So, so here we also have some basic tabs that show conclusions around these key factors and what they're, what we found in the studies. So some are going to be smaller text that basically captures the essence of, let's say, the timing of humanitarian assistance matters, and this will tell you a bit of that summary of what we concluded. Or, for example, things like this: conflict shocks that escalates insecurity or corruption, and basically understanding what we found in that section. And as you read through these key factors and their conclusions, it will inevitably kind of introduce and set the stage for the metrics, where you come onto this page or this section where interactive web map is present, where you can see the metrics. So the default view is on resilience capacity, and within each of these you are looking at some basic statistics around resilience capacity and the indexes that obviously were collected for the most part, not in all countries. As you can see, for example, in Kenya, we don't have that data, but we do have other resilience indicators in some instances. So let's say in Zimbabwe, there is no data for these indices, but there is quite a number of other resilience capacity indicators that were measured there. And when you click on the country and you want to know more about resilience capacity indicators, you can see what data we have, and if the data had baseline and endline values for that particular country, you can see the downward or upward trend, and you can see basically quickly what happened over time. For the most part, these indicators are showing percentage of households that are reporting a certain information, and then if you click on that link, it will take you to the actual report or the page where you can find more information about that particular country or the context. But for the most part, majority of data comes from Niger, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, also from Somalia. So oftentimes you're going to find most information on these contexts. And then as you go through these, you can also go into shocks and stresses. For example, if you want to learn more about shocks and stresses, you can click on a country and pull out indicators that are related to shocks. So here you can see we're looking at Niger shock indicators, and much like in the other cases, you see a lot of different indicators. And, Niger and Burkina Faso, for example, are going to have some overlapping indicators, but some are going to be different. So each country context kind of allows you to see information for that context in and of itself. So for example, here, in the coping strategies, we're going to have some information also for, say, Zimbabwe, because we've got indicators that are related to coping strategies for Zimbabwe, and or for Kenya, we don't have that. But obviously, that's the challenge that we're talking about here, that oftentimes the indicators aren't the same, or they're not presented for each of these contexts. So this is the solution that we found in so far as presenting picture across different contexts in a way that helps you kind of get a better sense of what happened in each context, or what conclusions that we talked about above really mean, because these are the metrics that put this into perspective. And then below in the next section, we see capacities that enable recovery and have a protective effect on households. So here, you're going to see also a bunch of countries for which we have this kind of information. And we see these effects based on their actual utility over time. So continuous protective effect, long-term protective effect for Burkina Faso, for example, while for Ethiopia, the picture is going to look different. So this chart allows you to see data by each context and draw your own conclusions about how that differs. While this particular tabular view here puts them all together. So with some color coding that you see here, you can kind of see how different capacities have that long or short-term effect depending on context. And you can see instances where, this could be useful to see how some assets, let's say like asset ownership, for example, has a different effect in different contexts, while there's some of these capacities that have generally a same effect for everybody. So access to financial resources sort of being more on this initial protective effect spectrum as well. So that's this section here. And then the next section here looks at resilience capacities that are critical for effective coping. And there are 4 that we've identified here at this time as the key sort of capacities and their effect on coping. And then here you can see additional capacities and approaches that are identified as potentially strengthening your household resilience. And much like the chart that I introduced at the beginning, this chart also puts the program data in perspective with some of these findings, and you can see a little more about what is covered. So for example, access to infrastructure, you can read about it, how it is associated with reduced selling, slaughtering of livestock, increased reliance. So you can kind of expand just like this here expands on that narrative behind this particular conclusion. That narrative is presented here through these popovers. And then you can see those indices here put together from baseline and endline values, just another way of looking at each of these. And then for each index, you can see its definition and you can read more about it if you go into a link, and it will take you to the methodological guide around how this is measured, which basically explains what the data presented here is and how to look at that data. And then at the bottom here, this is that 3rd line of inquiry for synthesis around takeaways from resilience programming and research. And we have 3 tabs here of main takeaways related to what works in resilience programming, what to consider when designing programs, and quite a number of conclusions here. And then monitoring and evaluation, learning, adaptive management for resilience programming has its own separate tab. So here you see concepts with their sort of short labels on the left-hand side, and the actual takeaway explained in this textual form. And that brings us to the conclusion of the page. So I'm going to stop here, go back to the screen and pause my presentation and give you a chance to react and ask questions.
I'm especially interested in everyone's reaction, so I don't want to take long to do this, Azra. I just want to follow up on a couple notes. One, with respect to the metrics. I think it's quite helpful to have some of this visually presented. And talking with Tango, we revisited, it's not as though these individual impact evaluation activities don't have full and detailed information aligned with their specific purpose, but that it's just that. When we're going through and designing research, including the protocols, the tools, the interpretation and write-up, obviously it's often for specific needs, specific decisions, and user groups. So we just didn't have the forethought at that time, and it may not have been possible anyway, but those were not designed with an eye towards standardization across all of them. So I think no fault of Tango, just an explanation why that work of finding comparable indicators has been really difficult for I4DI. So based on those kind of constraints, I think this is really helpful. The other general thing that we talked about with you, Azra, last week is that I think it's still quite useful rather than to focus on more. Could be very useful as communication to focus on less. What are some very simple, concrete takeaways that we can share with external audiences that are validated or backed up with evidence across these studies? So even if our messages tend to focus on fewer kind of core key takeaways, I think this could still represent a really solid advancement in terms of telling us what do we know collectively across all the work we've done under REAL. So I think those are just important. Let me toss it over to others who might have.
Just if I could add to your point here, just to say this initial version, as you will notice once you start interacting with this version, is going to give you a sense of what's possible to show. So you see all of the data here, but is everything really needed to show, or does it add value to see it this way? Is an open question. And if that's not the case, then, you know, kind of making some decisions jointly and gathering that feedback to be able to inform those decisions is really what we're looking for at this point in time.
Thank you. So on that note, and you see, Anne, you've entered a couple questions. If Ezra, if you can take a look at the chat and respond, and if others have questions and or suggestions, please, now's the time to chime in.
Okay, let me just see where we start with the questions. Okay, oh, so there's some screen issue. So would be very useful to include month year data were collected, e.g. baseline and endline month and year. Thank you, Anne. That's definitely doable, and we can take that into account. Perhaps if we're looking at, let's say, the country like this, in Ethiopia, we know the basic details about reports that informed this for Ethiopia, so we can include that maybe in this general description prior to looking at the indicators or figure out another way to do so, but that's definitely doable. The next point is, could you add a similar chart that shows which capacities didn't have impact? Well, we could, of course, do that as well. The question is only whether that's the story we want to tell, and how do we want to compose that storyline, I guess, because obviously, in a way, you know, what you see here is country basically specific, and some countries like in Burkina Faso, we've got quite a number of capacities, while in others like Zimbabwe, that's not a lot. So it seems from what we can see that oftentimes it's all, you know, dependent on that context, and understanding the context within which programming is being implemented is really key to determining what has an impact. But I guess we can look for conclusions across board for which capacities may not have impact anywhere. But it seems more like the conclusion here is that relevance of the context, and really, you know, other programmatic components that make some capacities work better than others.
Yeah, but this is Anne, but it's on both sides, right? I mean, if there's context and programmatic characteristics, etc., it applies just as much to those that do show that they work as those that didn't have an impact. And, you know, and the follow-on question there too, we have key takeaways on what works, but, you know, we learn also from what doesn't work. And I think even just from a serious learning perspective, having that fuller picture can be, you know, very useful and important, but also from an optics perspective, you know, we don't want to be just cherry picking and showing, you know, only the thing, or seem like we're cherry picking and only stressing the positive, when there is, like I said, learning from what doesn't work in particular contexts. Over.
No, I could only agree with that. Obviously, as I said, our initial framing on synthesis was what works. We were focused on identifying what works, and to identify what doesn't work, we would need to go back and apply that lens and pull that out. But I can see the value in it.
I agree with the utility of that, and I think, and maybe with some more time, I'm going through both the static synthesis document, but also this live version, we'll see some reference to those things that did not work. For instance, if we go back up to the very top, the measuring effects of and effectiveness of humanitarian assistance, I4DI is called out from Tango's evidence. There is not strong evidence that cash assistance had a positive effect on households' ability to recover from drought conditions. Now that is context specific, but
that could be a targeting issue, Tom.
I know it could, and we need to go through this content closely to determine whether it is one or not, and whether that's a finding that we want to include.
You have to be very careful interpreting that one. Yeah.
And others in terms of what works and what does not. Yes, we have evidence to comment on both, is my point. All of it needs to be contextualized.
Yeah, thanks. I had my hand up.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah, first, I really want to compliment the I4DI team. This is really attractive and informative, and to tick both boxes, that's a job well done. So I appreciate that a lot. Going up to the first slide, maybe this is just a semantic point or trivial or whatever, and perhaps a second slide. Could you scroll up, Azra?
Sorry.
First slide.
Oh, it's this, right? I don't know. Oh, sorry.
Oh, all the way up. Yeah.
Hang on. It seems like my sharing was paused or something, but let's see. Do you see?
Yeah, this one, maybe the one next one. I was curious. Yeah, the use of humanitarian assistance here, and even more so in the first slide.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in some very crude interpretation, humanitarian assistance is what happens when our resilience programming falls short, or the crisis is so huge that the resilience that's been built is inadequate. So, you know, I see it as more measuring effects and effectiveness of resilience programming, in part by averting humanitarian assistance, etc. I know Tim will probably have a point of, and I would agree that you know, actually resilience is the full package. It's risk reduction and capacities built, then safety nets and humanitarian assistance, and then recovery. So you know, it's the full thing. But this kind of titling draws attention to humanitarian assistance only, and it just struck me as strange.
Okay, I can see that.
I think we all appreciate your point, and that's the exact kind of feedback that, or one type of feedback that we definitely want is on the content of this, to make sure that whatever message we're putting out there is not misinterpreted.
There's a, not with everyone, but, you know, poorly informed colleagues, I think, sometimes assign resilience to humanitarian actions, and you know, building resilience is really important for kind of the development actors, and you know, any kind of messaging or labeling that we do to direct people in the right way, I think is important.
No, that's a really great point.
Yeah, this is Tim. I just wanted to emphasize, I had said to Tom earlier, maybe you wouldn't start this out with this. But one of the things that, as we talk, and as this HDP coherence is supposed to be now an important focus for USAID, resilience does allow you to do both the development and know when you need to step in with additional assistance when the risk environment is too great. And so one of the concerns I've had is those seem to be pulling apart again. And I really want to stress how important you need both in any resilience building. And so, and I think, John, you already knew I was going to say that, but the part I have a problem with is like when the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance is pulling away from the resilience and development, or he doesn't even want to use the word resilience half the time, bothers me. So I think that, I don't know if we should be allergic to the word humanitarian, if there's a better word that we can come up with, but you know, I do want us to make sure that we want to get the humanitarian folks and the development folks continuing to work together. Over.
That's a great point. I mean, from this standpoint, I just really want to emphasize that right now, what you see here is really that initial draft. And when it comes to messaging, when it comes to framing, and also the sort of description, our job was not to reanalyze, but to synthesize and present. So we're not really bringing new evidence forward here, or we're really trying to do justice to the evidence that was gathered and conclusions that were gathered through the years of program. So, so if you have direct recommendations or direct sort of text you think better represents what we need to say, or red ink is perfectly, of course, acceptable and expected here. So from this point on, this should really enter that co-creation to have this product be, you know, as good as it can get with all of the evidence that is there.
I think this is the type of feedback that you want, Azra. I'm going to interject here and pose the question of how can we most efficiently compile that feedback? And everyone, I assume, will have access to this link. And I think everyone's going to need more time to get very familiar with the details of the content that's in there. I'm thinking maybe we Save the Children could go through each of these windows and maybe put together some kind of accessible, maybe in Google Docs or something, a column with the content of the windows, and a column where we could list it on specific kind of graphics and or content that goes with those different visualization windows. I assume you've done this before, Azra, in terms of eliciting this feedback. If you have a better or preferred way of format of getting it, please let us know.
No, that's great. So what we've done in the past is have if you can imagine 3 columns, one column is the visual, the picture. The second column is the text in an editable text format. And the third column where you can take that text and edit it differently. Of course, you know, we're going to have lots of reviewers here, so there could be differences of opinion among the reviewers as well. So, you know, we can set this up and hand over to you, Tom, for Save the Children to facilitate that process, to come to an agreement around that feedback, if that's okay with you. But that would
That'd be
be
very helpful. Yes.
yeah. So we can set this up. We'll do window by window. We'll include the text and the visuals, and allow you the space to basically provide edits and changes as you see fit. So we'll try and make that most accessible. Perhaps for your purposes right now, it might be that the Google slides or slide deck or PowerPoint slide deck might be the easiest, but let us come to you with some format and go from there.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Karen, you have your hand on. Sorry for a long time. Apologies.
No, not so long. Thank you so much, Asha. And just to second John's comment, it's really exciting to see all of this work synthesized and consolidated and presented like this. So thank you. And kudos, because it's a lot to sift through. And we did a sort of synthesis activity of the resilience evidence for the horn, as you know, and then also under the scale activity, looking for components of resilience that did and didn't work. And I think as going back to the conversation prompted by Anne and you know, Tom and Tim earlier, what I appreciate about this in part is that it presents the data, but we also have some interesting stories to tell. And the humanitarian assistance story is one of those. I think that's kind of interesting. So, I mean, John, you're talking about the role of HA, and I think Prime is such a critical example of that, having the humanitarian assistance component, or sorry, GRAD, having that built into the project design and being able to trigger that and access it when it's needed, how important that is for overall kind of resilience programming, and how we see that in some contexts like Ethiopia, where that was built in and used effectively, it had a big impact, whereas other places in Sahel, for example, where perhaps the humanitarian assistance trigger wasn't quite as well developed, there's another story to tell. So I was just wondering how those stories might be able to link in to these particular data points around capacities and outcomes. By stories, I guess I mean sort of a kind of a quick synopsis of how.
You know, Karen, what I was thinking is once we get this where we want it to be, I think we can use it for, you know, you can use it in many interactive ways. You know, like if we want to do workshops or learning events where we're trying to make a particular point, I think there's several learning opportunities out of something like this. So, you know, so I already see a bunch of different uses for it.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering about the dashboard itself and the extent to which, you know, you could have the humanitarian assistance framed as part of the overall resilience package, and then kind of, you know, look at examples of where humanitarian assistance, just to be able to kind of share the story of how and when humanitarian assistance, just as one example, has been used effectively to maintain kind of resilience capacities and outcomes.
Yeah, maybe a word that might be more digestible for some folks is shock responsive safety nets, for example. You know, because that's under social protection, which is also getting a lot of emphasis in the agency, recognizing when a risk environment gets so bad that it overwhelms everybody, you know, and having a shock responsive safety net to clicks in, you know, kind of like the pandemic, that became a very important focus for a lot of people. So I think that, you know, if we are going to take this HDP nexus seriously, that we got to have terms that we can use that everybody's comfortable with, that they recognize that, oh, if you're doing that, then you're defeated. You're no longer a good programmer because you can't do development anymore. Well, sometimes we get overwhelmed by all the shocks that we're exposed to. So you need some kind of protection against that.
Maybe, I don't know if this is where you were getting at, but I'm just thinking that as part of the synthesis for the humanitarian assistance, we do have some analysis by country where it's like a short story, sort of summary around, say, humanitarian assistance in these countries. So I'm just thinking if it would be maybe useful to have this, which now is just a picture, be interactive, so that if you click on a country, you have a pop-up that tells the story for that particular country. So this is, of course, outside of what, Tim, you're saying, so definitely for the learning events and other purposes. I'm just thinking right now, primarily this particular page and what else we can render here without like overwhelming the visitor here also with too much text or too much information. So just a thought as you were speaking about whether or not that might be something that is useful, like a country summary, not just in numbers, but in like, yeah, written summary.
I think that would be great because, as you said, so the context really does matter. So a way of really summarizing very briefly some of those key points of the context that's important to keep in mind, that could be super useful.
Depending on what you might be able to hold together for that aspect, this is not something that we would continually.
Can't hear you, Tom.
Yeah, this is Azra. I'm just saying that idea we would not continually add, at least to your current scope of work on that. If we have follow-up conversations on how to summarize key findings and contextual considerations by country, Emily, this is something that we at Save the Children could take what I4DI has developed and package things in that way, country-specific briefs.
That's perfect. And then you can say, render it here or there. In terms of what's possible, you know, we can make this more interactive. So yeah, that would be great, Tom. John, you have your hands up.
Yeah, thanks. We were saying earlier, wanting or focused kind of on a positive spin or story that we would tell. I'm thinking of my experience in Ethiopia in 2015, 2016, where I mean, some pretty good resilience programming going on there. During that crisis, humanitarian assistance in kind of the pure sense, you know, the food aid, for instance, that WFP would distribute, et cetera, was notoriously late and only met like half of the targets because of funding shortfalls. And as a result, you know, a lot of household assets were kind of sold off, and a lot of households took on heavy debt. So the kind of collective resilience objectives that we had were kind of screwed by the issues with, I guess, effectiveness of humanitarian assistance, and whether. And we don't want to be casting blame on anyone, but we want to find out where, you know, kind of the weak links have been to use when negotiating with you know, the range of stakeholders. So I don't know if that information is visible in the analysis or could be pulled out, or is that considered as kind of too negative for this type of graphic?
Yeah, John, I'll take a first response, and Azra, maybe you can fill in. We look underneath the next window, Azra, key factors in humanitarian assistance, and understand we may want to revise the terminology, but we do have evidence to look at some of those factors. I mean, of humanitarian assistance and why that matters, and what reports we can draw from in making that assertion, as well as for emphasizing your points about what is really critical, including what has fallen short. I don't think we want to shy away from those for the purposes of learning. If we have evidence as to where we've fallen short or programs have, I think certainly we want to get it out there so it can be useful.
It was really late, WP is really late, and it's getting there late, then it didn't have the effect it was in terms of protecting assets or protecting people.
Definitely. I'm sorry, I got to go. Thanks again. Looking forward to getting the link to explore a little bit deeper. And thanks so much.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Azra. I think, again, mindful of your time, and we have a few minutes left for other points during this PMT. But Azra, yes, so if you can share a format that works for you, we're eliciting this feedback from this wider group, then we will follow up on it. And I think in general, what we had talked about, Azra, in terms of timeline was trying to get comprehensive feedback on each of these windows from everyone who has it to offer within the next 2 weeks. Does that still work for you?
That definitely still works for us. That's great timing. So thank you for setting that expectation. So within, the next day, you're going to get from us that format for feedback provision. And we're going to share that with you. Also, I just shared here the link to this page. So you can get to it just by using either the first or the second link. Regardless, it would be important just to emphasize that while this isn't published, it is publicly available to anybody with the link. So again, let's make sure that this link is held close and not shared until it's published, because obviously there's going to be quite a lot that's going to still change here. But we could also put this behind the firewall and put like a password behind it if you want that. For now, it's available to anybody with a link, so let us know if we need to put more protections.
We'll let you know. I think that'll suffice for now. We may want to make the link available to others who would have good technical input on the content, but point well taken that this is not for public dissemination yet. We're getting close, but not ready for prime time yet.
And just to add, I'm not sure. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we don't have the disclaimer. We don't have the correct logos up there. We don't have the, we haven't reviewed for FIBO compliance, all of that. So yeah, that we may want to put some sort of disclaimer at the top, just draft, or, not for, maybe something just to indicate that those things.
Definitely, we'll do that.
Does anyone have any final questions for Azra and Darren?
No, but I just wanted to say, I'm really impressed. You guys did a great job. So.
Yeah, I'll
Ditto.
Definitely agree.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll second that. I'm like overwhelmed and want to. Yeah, there's a lot to get into here. And I do also want to make sure that well, I will likely pick maybe 2 other people on my team to have a look at this as well and give some feedback, if that's okay.
Yes.
It's going to be hard to resist the urge to share this further, but I will try.
Well, we're really happy to hear that you guys are happy with this initial draft. And of course, it's like super exciting to see information presented in a format that the users can drive and gather more insights. I mean, we've learned more just since we've presented it this way because it helps see data in a different way. So looking forward to your feedback. Basically the goal would be within 2 weeks to gather that consolidated feedback. At that point, depending on the amount of revision work that needs to take place, we're going to aim to finish the changes in the least amount of time needed. So we can anticipate having another session with a select group of people to reveal the next iteration that also integrates that feedback from you all. So excited about receiving your feedback and bringing this to a successful completion.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Azra. Really appreciate all your work and for your presentation today. We'll get you feedback very soon. Thank you.